Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar titled Better Process, Better Feed, Designing Your Strategy for Product Diversification. This is part 2 of ICM's 4-part webinar series titled Looking to the Future Today, ICM's approach to efficient product diversification. With us today is Matt Durler, Vice President of Feed Development at ICM, and Dr. Mallorie Wilken, Feed Technical Nutritionist at ICM. My name is John Nelson. I'm the Vice President of Operations at Ethanol Producer Magazine. Before we get started, there are a couple housekeeping items we'd like to cover. One, we just want to remind everyone on today's webinar that it is being recorded, and we'll have the recording up on ethanolproducer.com sometime early next week. So if there's some information you want to go over again, by all means, you can go online and download the information and watch the video again. 2, we do encourage questions. However, what we do is we ask that you ask the questions in the GoToWebinar tab, the Questions tab in GoToWebinar. We will be addressing all the questions at the end. If we don't have time, we will make sure it gets passed on to the appropriate person, and you will be given an answer shortly after. So with that, we want to hear a word from today's sponsor. Oh, actually, we're going to talk a little bit about the 4-part series. So this is a 4-part series, as I mentioned. Part 1 happened back in November, and if you are interested in it, that was titled Efficient High Protein Feed Production for Revenue Diversification, and that took place on November 9th. If you're interested in watching part 1 in that video, it is on ethanolproducer.com. You can log in and watch that. As I mentioned, today we are on part 2, and then we have part 3 coming up titled Leveraging Equipment for Process Efficiencies, and part 4 titled Lowering Your Carbon Score While Diversifying Revenue. Stay tuned. We'll be sending out communication regarding those dates. Now, with that being said, we'd like to hear a word from today's sponsor, ICM.
ICM is proud to sponsor Looking to the Future Today, ICM's approach to efficient product diversification, a webinar series hosted by BBI International. Since 1995, ICM is focused on innovating and developing new technologies to support the production of renewable fuels and animal feed. More than 100 biorefineries worldwide have adopted its proprietary systems, designed to help plants realize higher profits and better operational efficiencies at every step of the process. A global leader in the biofuels industry, ICM offers design, engineering, manufacturing, implementation, and plant support. To date, ICM has completed more than 5,500 projects across more than 300 locations, including over 30 plant retrofits. Want to know more? Visit ICMinc.com or any of these social media platforms.
All right. First up in our discussion is Matt. And Matt, thanks for joining us today. Appreciate you being here. Now, we recently, I recently saw a press release with some exciting news between ICM and Coronel LP. Do you mind chatting a little bit about that with our audience?
Yeah, I think the timing of this is, really good with what we're going to talk about today. We're really excited about the Coronel LP project. From the first time we met Chris and Andy up there, it's just really evident how progressive these guys are and what kind of great partner they could be in something like this. They're already integrated in the feed space via the relationship with Gold Eagle Co-op, and I feel like they really understand the opportunity presented by optimizing feed to fit the end users. And we're really proud to be able to provide them that flexibility in a way that also allows them to improve their process efficiency at the same time and lower the overall carbon intensity. So we're excited internally. It's going to be a good project and really pave the way forward for a lot of things.
Excellent. That is, we're excited to see how, all the movement that's happening, and I'm sure the team at ICM is excited as well. So thank you for sharing that with us. With that, I'm gonna hand it over to both of you and let you do your portion. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you. I think the key concept that leads us to where we are with these diversified strategies going forward is the fact that ethanol is starting to reach maturity as an industry. And as we reach maturity, we need not look any farther than the crude oil industry to kind of understand how, as industries mature, products are refined. So if we look at crude oil, it was discovered as early as 600 BC and was effective as a replacement for things like whale blubber, but not much happened until the 1850s when Samuel Keir had a problem in his salt mine. Had these petroleum products just polluting the salt, he's putting it in the river, and it catches on fire one day. And it gives him the opportunity or the idea that, hey, I could do more with this. We were this way in the early 2000s, landfilling distillers, letting people pick them up when they wanted to. But he had the foresight to start refining that product, was able to make kerosene. A couple of years later, his colleague there at Seneca Oil, Edward Drake, drills the first oil well, and we're off to the races. But in a really inefficient way. The efficiency of gasoline and kerosene production at that point in time wasn't much. It took to the 1913 timeframe when William Burden and Robert Humphreys added pressure at Standard Oil that we really started to understand the crude oil industry as it is today. They doubled the efficiency, and we were off to the races. You look at that from whale blubber to kerosene to understand that today there's actually more specialty products made from petroleum than there is kerosene. And there's more than 66,000 products that are made from oil, all because they focus on what end users need. And while we may not be at whale blubber and distillers grains, we're probably someplace between Keir and Drake today. And we think we have a solution that can really propel us forward in the ethanol feed space as well. So when we look at distillers grains today, really it's the perfectly imperfect pile. And because everything's in that same pile, it really only works for our lowest value market, be it the ruminant, the beef animal. And to reach the higher value, the specialty markets we have over to the left, we've got to do more with it. So our take on that is, let's start by separating those components so that we can mix and match them as the end user, as the species need those, and start to add value through differentiation. And to do that, we're going to modify the base ethanol plant, because everybody's very familiar with this plant. We mill corn, we expose the starch so we can break it into sugar, we ferment it, we separate it. But all we make is ethanol, distillers corn oil, and distillers grains to try to be all things to everyone. Here at ICM, we're applying 4 of our proven process technologies as part of the advanced processing package to take this further. We'll start with selective milling, SMT, and move on to fiber separation technology, FST, followed by speed optimization technology, FOT, and for the tongue twister in the room, TS4, thin solid separation system. And what this looks like is really the ethanol process optimized or reimagined. We'll change our grind profile on the front end, add in FST to pull that fiber out ahead of fermentation and optimize our fermentation and distillation. We'll refine the feed in FOT, and we'll take the operational advantage like clarifying our thin stillage in TS4 to finish the products we make up. As you can see here, we no longer just have one distiller's pile. We have these 5 clean streams that we can do things with, in addition to traditional ethanol. So to think about what we can do, it's important we start looking at these 5 piles separately. And in doing so, these are the 5 piles we'll talk about today. we've got fiber or corn bran coming off of FST, followed by enhanced or condensed protein bile, a protein with yeast, our solubles, and our distillers corn oil. And I think it's also really important as we start thinking about these different piles to think beyond crude. Proximate analysis has been around for a long time. And in the early 1900s, they did a great job of telling us more about feed than we ever known before. But when we think about crude fat, crude fiber, crude protein, it doesn't really tell us all that we need to know. And Dr. Wilken, can you expand a little bit about how you would look at these metrics?
Absolutely, and thank you so much because I'm really excited to be here. So when I was in grad school and the ethanol boom was just starting and I was able to do a lot of research on distillers grains feeding in cattle, but what I'm the most excited about now is because we can separate out these products and actually go past that crude positioning, we're able to better understand why we've had the feed efficiency or performance impacts that we have in the cattle industry as well as in other species. Now, when we think of that feed value, and now that we can finally pull those piles apart where we can focus on the fiber or the protein or even the yeast particles, we're able to better understand what is in each of these piles. So we can look at amino acid ratios, we can look at those macronutrients and really better understand how to put those into diets. But just because we have those components within each of the piles doesn't mean it's necessarily available to the animals. So we have to do some research and figure out the digestibility of those products because we need to make sure that we're having a positive impact on the animal and we can actually leverage some of that value back out of those feed products. Now, the things that we haven't really ever been able to study before is the prebiotic space, which mainly is the yeast. Now, we all understand that the yeast is not within the corn product that's coming into the system. It's actually the yeast that we're utilizing during fermentation. So it's one of those portions that just kind of gets to come along for the ride, but we've never been able to pull it apart or back out of distillers grains before, and now we're able to do that. We know that yeast has had significant impacts and promotion of overall gut health and immunity. So being able to really leverage that type of value, that type of monetary value that we can put into even the pet and aquaculture is going to really impact the plant's bottom line. Now, the things that we don't usually think about, but we often consider, is that of color and flavor. And distillers has always been very favorable when it comes to the cattle industry. Cows love distillers grains. I mean, if you put it out in the pasture, they're just going to eat that up, bed down, and love every minute of it. But we have to make sure that as these processes start changing the feed products, that we're controlling that color and flavor when it comes to those animals.
So as we think about the higher value purposes or really intensifying our focus on these products, it's also important to think about how does the process itself impact the products we produce. And while I'm going to focus heavily on the feed side today, it is important to understand that each part of this process was built around optimizing the ethanol plant to start with. And in doing so, we're dewatering as we go. And by pulling the water out, we're not only saving energy, we're allowing ourselves to handle these products with kid gloves to maintain their digestibility at every point. So we'll start off by talking about SMT very briefly. And really what SMT is us rethinking the front end of the plant. How do we control the particle size such that we can enhance our separation, but also reduce the overall horsepower it takes to mill the corn and run the ethanol plant? That sets us up well for really the workhorse of this system in fiber separation technology. FST can be thought of as just simply as our fiber press, but the fiber press does a lot for us. We're pulling out about a third of the total distillers pile before fermentation, and this is the really bulky stuff that likes to plug exchangers that adds nothing into our fermenter because we're not going to make alcohol out of it in a traditional sense anyhow. And it takes a lot of energy to heat and cool just to end up on our distillers pile anyway. So we pull this out on the front end, we're able to optimize the process behind it, but really create an interesting feedstuff in and of itself. And when we look at this, this is an AFCO product corn brand. You can see that we got quite a bit more crude fiber in it than traditional distiller's grains, and really good fiber in that. But Mallorie, if you talk a little bit why we might look beyond crude when we study fiber.
Oh yeah, and fiber, when it comes to crude fiber, is the most difficult numbers to understand because not all fiber is created equal. When you have your structural fibers that you'll find in alfalfa hay, all the way down to soy hulls, which is extremely digestible. So not all fiber is created equal. However, when we think about fiber, that is mainly advantageous in the cattle and dairy industries. So when we look at that neutral detergent fiber is a piece that is readily available to cattle, just to cattle themselves. And that's pure energy that's coming back into their full digestive system. Acid detergent fiber is what's not available, but they have the bugs to digest significant amounts of fiber that can offer energy to that animal and really make performance improve.
So when you think about this, Mallorie, you talked about structural fiber and non-forage fiber in the case of soils. Can you explain a little more about why that might be relevant?
So soils is a great example of why corn bran is so valuable. It's extremely digestible, it's utilized for energy, and as previous research has illustrated, we can even replace up to 30% of the corn within a dairy cow's diet and not depress any type of performance. We're actually able to increase overall milk fat and milk yield because as those bugs start digesting that soy hulls and digesting that fiber, they're going to have faster turnover because it's going to be more readily digestible, and that just improves overall performance of that dairy cow. So it offers plenty of energy back to that animal.
Moving into the next phase, I want to take a second to look at the process. So ahead of fermentation now, this fiber pile we're talking about, it is now leaving the process stream, headed straight to the dryer, to the wet pad, depending upon your local market. So the stream we're feeding through fermentation now, concentrated carbohydrates and protein to then allow the yeast to do their work and have an optimized environment. And then when we come on to distillation, we also don't have that bulky mass to work through. So when we get into FOT, or our feed optimization technology, what we're able to do with that smaller stream is just do a lot more work with it. So since we have a third less solids, we can improve that torque and not only get a drier pile, but also spin away a lot of the impurities. This better separation gives us a cleaner pile that has less risk of being damaged as it heats the dryer later on. And Dr. Wilken, when we look at this is our most dense energy or protein pile that we can create in the plant. This looks a lot like corn gluten meal, maybe a really high concentrated pile of protein, but still seems to look like corn protein. Can you talk about what you're looking at when you see this pile?
So when we originally started feeding distillers grains, it was basically for the protein, right? And then we started experiencing quite a bit of energy benefits in the cattle industry as we fed higher levels of it. But not all protein is created equal, much like I said with fiber. But protein is not necessarily protein. It all depends on what that protein is made of. Corn protein is challenging because lysine is an amino acid that is usually the first limiting amino acid within swine diets or poultry production. But that lysine to leucine ratio is a little out of balance. We more so want it to be a 1-to-1 or 1-to-1.5 ratio, especially in swine diets. But corn protein offers a 1-to-4. Now, this is something that we can overcome, but it definitely bodes a situation where we need further understanding, which is why research is so valuable.
So I've heard you talk about bypass protein. How is that relevant to this kind of product?
So bypass protein, and primarily looking at the comparison of corn gluten feed or corn gluten meal, the concentrated protein portion of corn gluten seed, corn gluten meal is probably the best comparison that we can have to this protein pile. And I say that because it's still corn protein. Corn gluten meal is made up of 65% crude protein, but it still has that 1-to-4 ratio. So where it's been the most advantageous is in that dairy space as a bypass protein. So what that means is that bypass protein is actually going to bypass the rumen, end up in the small intestine, and those amino acids are going to be digested and absorbed in the small intestine. What that can allow us to do is actually improve overall digestibility and performance, and it improve the extent of fiber digestibility within that rumen, because those bugs are concentrating on the fiber because the protein's already gone.
Can you expand a little bit on how it might be used in some of these higher value markets? Say it's not widely used, but what are the limitations or what are the opportunities in those spaces?
The only limitations we can see is this lysine to leucine ratio, and primarily in the swine industry, where we want that to be more of a 1-to-1. But where we have the greatest advantage is when we start looking at pet food markets. The high concentration of this protein with its palatability really offers some opportunity to get into the pet market, where we know we can get a greater line of return.
Okay. Moving forward in the process, we've now taken the largest percentage of this protein out via our decanter cake here at FOT. This is a little over 5 pounds of this stream. But the clears off of this have a lot of suspended solids, and that's what led us to create TS4 to start with. And so what this patented technology does is pull those suspended or semi-soluble solids out of the system. It's about 3/4 of a pound a bushel, but it's really a dynamic product. And when I look at this and I see it's only 42% protein, Dr. Wilken, looks like, hey, we're just diluting our protein pile. Why would we feed this, or what's the advantage of this?
Just like I said before, not all protein is created equal, and the best part about this protein is that it has all this extra good stuff that we haven't been able to recognize before. So when we look at this high quality protein, not only is it highly digestible, but look at that lysine to leucine ratio. It definitely brings us more in line with what we would prefer for a swine or poultry diet, from a 1 to 1.5 as opposed to a 1-to-4 ratio. It's easily digestible, and the biggest portion that offers the most insight and the most opportunity for return is that prebiotic content, those yeast bodies, those yeast cell wall components. When you're talking about beta-glucans or anything like that, we're basically improving or have the opportunity to improve overall immunity and digestibility when we have that yeast in there. Now, in 2017, the VFD was enacted in the beef industry. So VFD is the Veterinary Feed Directive, where we started to have more control requirements were placed on feeders, that they had to document all of their feed additives, especially when it comes to antimicrobials or antibiotics. And so the yeast space is really, really growing. So we're going to start wanting more of these opportunities as we move away from antibiotics and more towards natural immune support, and the yeast offers that opportunity. Of course, it also helps that it increases the palatability and the color, so we get some of that greater intake, but it's really going to help offer a lot of opportunity and payback when it comes to that all-natural antibiotic space.
Definitely an interesting pile. Are there any commercial ingredients you think have a lot of these same components, Dr. Wilken?
Well, the interesting thing is it's probably not directly, but when we look at fish meal, it's probably the most comparable when we talk about just crude protein to crude protein of the enhanced protein with yeast. It's a high quality protein, much like fish meal, and it definitely offers that flavor component. While fish meal does not have the yeast, we do, which offers that palatability. But what we notice is in these highly digestible proteins and in this that we've offered to poultry in the past, looking at a broiler chick's recent study, is they were able to eat more because they liked it more. And when I'm talking about eat more, these products are not fed at high levels. So yes, the enhanced protein plus yeast is only 3/4 pound per bushel, but we're only going to be feeding 0 to 5% at a starter, or anywhere from 0 to 2.5% during the growing phase of any of these animals. And that's only going to improve performance with increasing levels. But there's definitely a balance where we want to be able to have enough performance, but not give up too much of what that product might cost. So fish meal is probably the most relevant, that those broiler chicks did improve in performance as levels increased, and we would expect to see the same thing when we look at the enhanced protein with yeast of our products.
Yeah, definitely interesting to see how such a small stream might punch above its weight in its overall value.
Absolutely.
So after TS4, we've been able to remove a lot of these suspended solids, and that does a lot for the rest of our process. I liken this somewhat to trying to boil milk. When you have all these suspended solids in it, it's really problematic. But after TS4, the solubles, which are about 4 pounds a bushel, just under 1/3 of our initial distiller's pile, are a completely different stream. As you can see the two pouring here, it's important to note that once we remove those suspended solids, or a good portion of those, the product viscosity drops dramatically. 10 times less viscous lets us concentrate it up, and that gives us a whole different realm of possibilities. So when we look at this, if we just look at the ash content, 20% ash, 19% ash, a lot. But when we get into the hood and look beyond crude, that ash seems to offer some value and opportunity.
Oh, for sure. I really like this product mainly because it puts us into a different position and of where we can be able to use it. Now, nutritionists are trained to understand mineral content and really look at the benefits of that. But when I really think about what the mineral content is of any syrup or solubles within this system, it's basically like when we get the energy added on to the protein that we feed with distillers grains traditionally. We're trying to feed for the protein supplementation, but you get the energy that comes along for the ride. So as we're feeding syrup or solubles, we're not just getting all of this mineral content, we're also getting the glycerol for higher density of energy, especially when you start feeding it with corn. So there's a lot of benefits outside of just being more viscous and easier to handle, which comes to the feeding portion. So where we kind of see this product being the most competitive is really in that liquid supplement space, because there's not a whole lot of competition there currently. Right now, it's pretty much just cane molasses, as it's a really good carrier. And like our syrup and soluble stream now, we also have those other micronutrients, macronutrients, and minerals that are coming along for the ride. So when we compare ourselves to cane molasses, we're going to be able to be really competitive. And we can follow cane molasses and its support since 1979 into 1993, 2006, even 2017. Research is consistently being done. Cane molasses is still being used for primarily those liquid supplement carriers, and so it'll be a really easy space for us to be competitive and enter into that market.
Another hot topic with the advancement of renewable diesel is distiller's corn oil. And an important thing to think about on this is all the process opportunities we're giving to remove more oil mechanically. So without the same O&M that it takes with a lot of flocculants or proteases and other enzymes, we're getting at everything we can get at mechanically before we step into the additional OPEX. And while I believe most of this is going to go in the renewable diesel space because of the value there, you just talk briefly about the value of distiller's corn oil in the nutrition space.
You know, it was really interesting because I think I may have still been in grad school when the base tricanners came online, and some 200 out of the 206 ethanol plants within the U.S. decided to start pulling corn oil out. So we had to start evaluating the changes that were made within the distiller space, especially with cattle feeders, and what type of energy that corn oil offered to the feeder as it was just riding along with the distiller's grain. So what we found out and what we felt really, really quickly within the feed yard industry is that oil had a lot of energy value. Now, in the southern states, there's a lot more energy fed because we need more energy per bite consumed because of the hot weather down there. Cattle definitely don't like to eat when it's super hot. I don't like to eat when it's super hot, so I understand where they're coming from. But generally, we would add tallow or some type of other fat source to increase the energy level of that diet. And what we learned is as we separated out that corn oil, feeders were actually buying that corn oil back because it was cheaper than tallow. So it just offered another revenue stream for the plant and a cheaper offering for energy for the feed yards themselves.
We spent the first half or two-thirds of our discussion today talking about the clean trials and how we get there. The next part of this, we're going to talk about the animal food studies and where we see value to the end users. And Dr. Wilken, if you will, please go into how you might look at evaluating these kind of products.
So I went to school for a long time, and I'm a nerd. So all of this data and everything means a lot to me, and I really love what I get to do. But basically what we're trying to do is we're really trying to understand what each of these products has. So that means we have to put them to the test. So before I had talked about how we can better understand the amino acid content, macronutrients, fiber levels, and also what's available. So that's primarily what we're trying to do within these digestibility studies, is when we look at the feedstock, we have to know, and lab analysis will tell us what we know as the traditional levels of the, say, crude protein or crude fiber, and we can even evaluate the feedstuff itself down to specific amino acids or even cell wall components. So as we put that back into the feedstock and we subtract that from what might end up on the pen surface, we finally learn not just what's in the feed, but what's available to the animal within the feed. So even though we might have a high concentration of a certain spec within the input feed, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's available to the animal and can be readily utilized. So that's why we wanted to look at the digestibility studies and really challenge these products to better understand not just what is in them, but what can actually be advantageous for the animals themselves.
I think this is an interesting look when we think about how we integrate with our end consumers or end users. Literally anything that hits the pen floor is wasted, and by giving them more that they want, we should be able to optimize the value chain as a whole.
Absolutely. For years, we've overfed the protein portion of distillers' grains to cattle because we were able to get a really great energy response. But most of that nitrogen landed on the pen surface. Now we're able to transfer that nitrogen over into the protein pile and offer less protein to cattle, which they don't actually need as much as, say, poultry or swine.
So as we move forward here, referencing back to those initial docs, we're not going to talk much about DCO because I think we'd all agree that most of that oil is going to end up in the fuel space, at least for the foreseeable future. When we think about these other four piles we have a lot of flexibility in the way that we recombine those. And what we'll focus on here is our signature product, which we call Protomax, which is our enhanced protein with yeast. We'll also then talk about SOLBRAN, and I just want to make note at the bottom here, we're giving you flexibility to recombine them however you want to hit the specs that your local market may find its value in. So first of all, Protomax, our high protein feed, is put together in a sense to have broad appeal to a wide range of animals by bringing that concentrated amino acid profile we found in that steady cake back. We've really opened up the spectrum that it appeals to instead of just focusing on dairy, to be able to hit the whole spectrum of higher value space, starting with the pets, the aquaculture, as well as kind of the honey hole for the bean meal in pigs and chickens. And the key component to start this is just concentrating up what they want. As we've moved from maybe a 30 crude protein that traditional distillers grains would be up to 50, we've also then concentrated up each of these amino acids. And when we look at the first limiting being lysine, really important that, hey, we're up around 2% now, and actually far closer to where soybean meal is than traditional distillers was. So when we look at the concentration we have there, then I guess the next question is, can they digest it?
Absolutely. And what we wanted to do is we first wanted to challenge it into poultry, mainly because, well, one, they're cheap. They're cheap to feed and it gets done very, very quickly. And they're extremely efficient. So when we looked at that concentration in the previous slide, we knew what was available to within the feed itself, but what can actually be utilized. So that's why we wanted to look at the digestibility in poultry, mainly because when we look at poultry digestibility, it's a 1-to-1, 1 to 1.5 times of ratio. So pound of feed per pound of gain, they're extremely efficient. And so if there's any amino acid available, they're going to digest it. They're going to get it. So we're going to be able to learn the most when we just look at the poultry side themselves. Now, what we expected is pretty much what we saw. Since we were able to take that fiber out, we were then able to concentrate that amino acid profile up. We were able to take out a lot of that bulk because, I mean, chickens don't digest fiber very well. We don't digest fiber very well, but chickens definitely do not digest fiber very well. So looking at traditional distillers grains, Protomax, without that fiber source in there, was really able to concentrate that lysine level up. We've even been able to exceed some of that of other high protein feeds that are on the market. So that lysine level becomes a lot more attractive in its availability when we take that fiber portion out. Methionine is also extremely important when it comes to poultry. Lysine and methionine are pretty much the first limiting, which is why we're looking at these two currently. But what we notice is they're the ones that are excelling. The Protomax is not just highly concentrated in protein, but it's also highly available. So when we look at that total amino acid digestibility in poultry, we were able to exceed that of traditional distillers grains because of that concentrated protein and other high protein feeds on the market, mainly because of the process of how we made those clean piles and the way that we recombined them.
Yeah, I think this is a great story. We start with being able to concentrate the pile, that's great. But when we leverage that with improved digestibility or availability to the animal, it has a compounding effect on their return. And that really starts to speak of the value creation we have in this process.
So after poultry, though, we have to understand how it works in swine. Swine is our second largest from a pounds produced standpoint. So we better understand how swine are impacted by this feed. Now, traditionally, soybean meal is the one is the major protein source when it comes to swine because of its amino acid profile. Its amino acid profile has that 1-to-1 ratio of lysine to leucine, and it's towards that 50% mark when we're looking at crude protein. So we wanted to challenge ourselves not just to other high protein sources and distillers grains, but also to that soybean meal because that is the most readily used within the swine industry. What we were able to note was that within this specific digestibility study within swine is really looking at that lysine level. We exceed that significantly of distillers grains and other high protein feeds, and that ratio becomes a lot more attractive from lysine to leucine when we're looking at Protomax versus that of the other two, the high protein feed and distillers grains, and more similar to that of soybean meal within swine. So it exceeded our expectations. It's there, it's available, and we're able to actually capture it within the animal. So it's not just available, but that concentration and taking out that fiber has actually offered a lot more of that digestibility and absorption to swine. So that total essential amino acid digestibility is significantly improved. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to become really competitive in that soybean meal market. So we'll be able to exceed that of any type of price when it comes to high protein, other high protein feeds, or even distillers grains traditionally. This is a feed product that is not necessarily in the commodity space. It is a protein supplement that's going to be able to compete really nicely and displace some of that soybean meal.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. It's too bad we don't have corn up here as well. But when we look that through our process improvements, we've been able to move the digestibility of this protein, even in pork, where we're a little bit challenged, to be closer to soybean meal than we are to corn or traditional distillers grains. And that's before we even take into account the added benefit of the energy that we're bringing to the party.
Yeah, we haven't even talked about energy yet. But even so, we've been able to improve that overall digestibility and amino acid availability, which is only going to improve the swine industry as a whole. Now, the big booming one, and the one that everyone's trying to get into, is definitely in the farmed fish segment of animal production or meat production, if you want to call fish meat, how a protein source for people.
I'm Catholic.
Right. So, yeah, farmed fish is definitely on the rise and is a new budding industry. So we don't know a whole lot about it. We don't know a whole lot about the amino acid requirements or overall feed requirements, or I guess you would call it fish food requirements, when we're talking about farmed fish. So at this point in time, when we're looking at digestibility, basically if they consumed it, they grew and less was lost. That means that they absorbed it. So yay, that means it's a winning comparison. So it's one of those things that we don't really know much about the requirements, but hey, if they're growing and they're growing faster than a competitor, then I guess we're all winning. And that's kind of what we saw here is we were able to really exceed that of any other high protein feed. Now we did compare this to fish meal because fish meal is the primary protein supplement when we're talking about fish diets. And in this trout study, we were able to see how highly competitive Protomax could be, not just from an intake standpoint, but also a digestibility standpoint. So that lysine is not only consumed, but it's also highly absorbed. Now, when we look at that leucine level, that also looks really attractive, and even methionine. So we know that what's available to the animals or to the fish is actually being absorbed because these performance numbers allow us better to understand what is actually the benefit of that Protomax and that consumption. The coolest part about it is fish meal is probably, highly expensive at times depending on where you're at, but Protomax can definitely be a cheaper option if that's what you're looking for. So we may not be able to displace all of it, but we can definitely disrupt that market and offer a different protein source that's readily available.
Yeah, with it trading $1,500 or $1,600 a ton, I guess you shoot for the moon and miss. You still have among the stars, and a lot of opportunity to even go further here.
Absolutely. Slow down, cowboy.
Technology's not always been my friend. We know who the fall guy is. Moving on from the protein discussion, now we'll move over to talk about SOLBRAN, the high energy feed produced. And SOLBRAN is just that. The famed Dr. Mass here locally came up with this name. So this is bran Insolubles, both AFCO definitions that tell you exactly what the feed is. But now the question is, how does it perform?
So I really, really like this product. I'm really excited about it because I think it has a very special market that it can fit into. So I had said earlier that soy hulls, that's why we made this comparison, is that soy hulls is a really highly digestible fiber. It is not necessarily that structural fiber, but it's a highly digestible fiber that offers a lot of energy to the animals. So looking at that soy hulls and even beet pulp, SOLBRAN, even though it's lower in protein, offers a significant amount of fiber digestibility through a 48-hour NDF study. Now, we did compare this to dry corn gluten feed, mainly because that's more of a combination product that could be comparable to that of SOLBRAN, and I say that because dry corn gluten feed, or gluten feed in general from the wet milling industry, is the brand with the steep liquor put on it. However, when you dry it down, it definitely suffers from that Maillard reaction, and some of those sugars gets burned. So we definitely see a decrease in that overall digestibility when we compare it to dry corn gluten feed, which only offers a lot of opportunity for SOLBRAN in that space.
Yeah, certainly. I think this tells the story of the importance of clean separations. Where that gluten feed may have 20% sugar left in it or starch left in it, it's giving a lot of opportunity to get damaged in the dryer. And through the process improvement to clean this up, I think that the results speak for themselves.
Absolutely. Now, so we really wanted to challenge SOLBRAN, though. Like, what is it? How can we use it? Is it going to be competitive? Because remember, the cattle industry is where distillers grains originally got its traction, right? So you can basically feed anything to a cow and they're going to make protein out of it, some really awesome protein. So I kind of think that they're superheroes, which is why I went into this industry. I love it so much. But what they're able to do, so what we really wanted to do is would SOLBRAN be able to stand the test against already understood parameters and understood feedstuffs within the market? So comparing it to wet corn gluten feed, which has not suffered that Maillard reaction from the dryers, we really wanted to challenge ourselves to see where we would land when it comes to the value of this product. So we wanted to do a finishing study, which is the most challenging thing to do, is a finishing study in cattle and in the winter and in South Dakota. So we call this a win, because what we were able to do was we were able to maintain performance when we looked at either feeding a corn control diet, a traditional diet that would normally be fed. We've replaced that corn portion with 20% SOLBRAN or 20% wet corn gluten feed. So intake was maintained. Average daily gain was numerically different, though not statistically, but even so it was only numerically different. That numeric difference still has an impact to the bottom line to a feed yard. So feed conversion, we see that that is a really positive move, that we're above wet corn gluten feed. We're able to offer more energy, that digestibility stands that test, and we're able to create some really high value animals out of that treatment. Now, we wanted to better understand some of the metabolizable energy, because we don't necessarily calculate metabolizable energy and amino acid content or digestibility within the cattle industry. So we decided to challenge it within the swine industry. So what we decided to do is we wanted to look at traditional distillers grains, a couple different options, and test it against SOLBRAN. Now that's a pretty hard test, right? Like, the fiber content alone is significantly increased proportionally within SOLBRAN compared to that of distillers grains in any shape or form. So that gross energy might be higher in the distillers grains A, but that overall metabolizable energy that will lead to higher performance and better performing animals is in the SOLBRAN. So even though it's fiber, it's still readily available to swine. And what we see, even with the amino acid profile, that amino acid digestibility of what's available and actually retained by the animals still remains really positive when we're talking about SOLBRAN. That is only about 20% protein, as opposed to distillers grains that could be about 30% protein. So if you think about that, the protein in and of itself is different, but those concentrations of those levels still remain really similar and highly impactful.
Yeah, this is really encouraging, as we've intentionally pulled high-value protein away to see that while not its target market, the SOLBRAN can still compete, or still a quality product into the swine space, particularly maybe sows, something along those lines.
Absolutely.
So as we get to the market opportunity, we've talked a fair bit about our options here. And as we start out, the Protomax, the SOLBRAN, or the opportunity to recombine and make traditional distiller's grains. For somebody that's just trying to get their foot into the space but wants to maintain a tag, we can make 3 or 3¼ pounds of Protomax, while at the same time hitting a 26 Pro kind of tag, or altering that mass balance to hit whatever Pro fat we need to in those residual distiller's grains. But we're also giving you the opportunity to make 5 pounds or even beyond. We believe we can make the biggest pile in the industry of fermented corn protein. And in doing so, a residual product, we've talked a fair bit about, a SOLBRAN, competes really well. And we think when you look at the value of corn gluten feed and think that we can and should be well above that, or how soy hulls will trade this time of year, it shows you kind of what the underpinnings of that market can be, and give you the confidence to let's go further and continue this discussion and make as much money in the system as we can. Also, as we've done this, we've unlocked these other higher value markets. When you look at the market for SOLBRAN, that still looks a lot like traditional distiller's grains. But what we've been able to do is provide access to the higher value markets. And while there's definitely some nuances to the pet industry in and of itself, the fact that the product has value there and is being considered shows you some of the returns of the guys that have been in the space for a while. The interesting piece with aquaculture growing and its appeal in poultry and swine is really we've opened up a whole new market. Is today, the non-ruminants make up less than 10% of our distillers market. And the fact that we can focus on this really expands the potential of our pile. With that, I'll throw it back to you, John.
All right. Appreciate it. Thank you, Matt and Mallorie. We appreciate all the information you've shared with us. Getting excited about fish meal. So appreciate it. We do have a couple questions here. I'm kind of sorting through that we want to ask you that have come in. The first question, and then I'll address it to both of you, and you guys can decide who wants to take it. First question is, do you anticipate an impact on differentiated corn-based feed products from the global increase of soybean meal production?
I'll let you start, Mallorie.
Well, since there's been a lot more soybean meal produced lately, I don't think that we're going to have a problem competing. Protein is definitely in high demand globally, especially as we have that middle class growing globally, especially in China. They're going to want more protein. So we're going to need more feed and more protein feed on the market. And that's an avenue that we're going to be able to access with some of our products.
And I guess in my mind, to take this a step further, while we use bean meal as kind of a standard for pricing, what makes Protomax different also provides opportunity beyond bean meal. When we talk about the value of yeast and those prebiotic components, the energy, the other half of this pile we don't talk about with meal, still allows us to differentiate. But from an economic standpoint, we also have a ton of distillers grains on the market right now. And we see the overall protein market somewhat compressed in value. We're trading at relativities to corn down around parity on a dry matter basis. It also shows that we're already feeding distillers grains as an energy, and we already have a viable energy option via SOLBRAN. So what I focus on is the spread between where distillers grains are and where bean meal or the opportunity for Protomax takes us is still really there. And there's a nice return on these projects and actually allows us to go to the clean piles and differentiated feeds a little faster.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. We have a question that just came in here. Any chance of Protomax going to a human food application?
Definitely, maybe. So the key component of that is not the feed itself. Dr. Wilken did a good job of talking a little bit about the opportunities maybe in that SETI cake stream in particular as it looks like a lot of things that go into the artificial meat space already. The question really would be around the compliance side of the ethanol facility in and of itself. It would have to be food grade with all the ISO standards that are replicable to that. So the process itself doesn't have any limitations, but there would be a lot more required of the plant to hit that food grade registration. And I think people find some of that is true of the pet space as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You're going to have a pretty tough time. I mean, we even have a little bit of a tough time getting distillers grains into pet foods because people just don't like it on the label. They don't want to read that. So we definitely have to rebrand these feeds and better understand how we can make them work within each species, because they're not byproducts anymore. They're not even co-products anymore. Mm-hmm. By putting in these systems and creating these feeds, you're creating feed products, and you have to make sure that you understand what that means and being a part of the feed industry. So ultimately, you're diversifying yourself from not just ethanol, but into that feed space. So regulatory challenges could potentially be there, not to say that they wouldn't be able to be overcome, but it would definitely take a lot of commitment and understanding of the goal and how to get there, but very possible.
Great. We have another question here that came in. It's regarding some of how you're tracking your stats, some of your analytics. They're asking, which high protein feed are you comparing within your amino acid profile slide? Was it another technology or a corn gluten meal?
Other distillers-based protein products. Without going any more specific than that, we got to have industry parameters, but also it's important to understand, as a whole, we want to move the industry forward rather than create a lot of friction between us and maybe other technologies. So finding baselines of things that we can agree upon that allows broader market access really helps us all.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. How does producing these feed products with ICM technologies affect the carbon intensity of an ethanol plant? This is a question and a topic that's hot right now, and a lot of people are interested in discussing the carbon footprint.
Yeah, this is one that's near and dear to us. These process technologies were all born out of operational improvements. And in doing so, at each step of the process, we're doing more with less. And that's true sustainability by any metric, doing more with less. So we're really proud of the fact that we're able to reduce our carbon intensity while improving the flexibility of the feed offering. And in most cases, this is between 2 and 4 points of CI per gallon.
Great.
I just stay in the feed space. That's my sandbox.
Right. Sure. All right, we have time for one more question. If you're sitting around your crystal ball, and you both, if you both can answer this, it'd be great to get your feedback from both of you. But where do you see the feed industry going?
I'll let you take it first.
So for me, the feed industry, I see it going to very species-specific products. I see the feed industry going away from antibiotics and away from antimicrobials. So we're going to need really high-quality feed products to replace those so that we can keep improving overall animal health and welfare, which is a constant topic of discussion anymore, that if you're not improving the animal state of overall health and well-being, then even if the performance improves, you're not going to be able to be successful in that market as a feed ingredient. So we want to make sure that even though we're changing the plant and we're changing the feed, that the feed is advantageous for the species in which each of those are marketed into. So I see it as growth potential, and like I said earlier, with the middle class growing, even through COVID, we've seen the middle class and further protein demand increase. So that means that we have to have more of a supply. So keeping protein coming and having those diversified feed products is definitely going to offer a lot of bottom line revenue to an ethanol plant.
And I think I'd expand upon the first part of Dr. Wilken's discussion. It's really a systems approach to feeding that is shifting. Antibiotics have been a Band-Aid for a long time, and as you pull those out, and as the genetics we're working with change, we can shift the overall feed systems to positively impact animal health and subsequently performance. And the other thing that's really fun about where we're at when we think about, hey, what's next, is we have these 5 clean piles that can each be optimized. So instead of just thinking about the feed system for beef, we think about the production system of the ethanol plant with the beef customer or maybe the pork customer. And how do you optimize each component that they utilize? And since we already have these 5 clean piles, we're really setting our customers up well for what's next to further refine based upon what their end users find value in. And that's the fun stuff.
Ultimately, making species-specific feeds that are the most advantageous for each industry.
Mm-hmm. Great. No, that was articulated very well. That makes a lot of sense. And so, is there anything else you guys would like to share with the audience? Any final
to the CI question, I think webinar number 4 will be a really interesting one for people that are interested in CI.
Great.
Good.
Well, we hope everyone has a Merry Christmas and really appreciate the time today, John.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, Matt, Dr. Wilken, we appreciate you guys sharing your insights with us and ICM putting on their your webinars with us. And to remind everyone, today's webinar is sponsored by ICM, and there will be a part 3 coming up. In part 4, we will be sending out communication regarding those times and dates. A couple other events coming up. We have the International Biomass Conference and Expo, and I know that's gearing up to be very popular, and that's taking place March 14th through the 16th in Jacksonville, Florida. A lot of, all things biomass are really covered under that, and right now sustainable aviation fuel is a big piece of that agenda, and I know that's been a hot topic. So definitely check that website out. We also have the Carbon Capture and Storage Summit, co-located with the International Fuel Ethanol Workshop and Expo, taking place June 13th through the 15th in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And also co-located at that event is the Biodiesel and Renewable Diesel Summit. So a lot of events taking place under one roof, and we hope everyone on this call can join us. Again, we appreciate you spending time with us, and we look forward to seeing everyone on the next Part 3 webinar. Have a great afternoon.